Hello, my name is Michael Tessar and I prepared this presentation entitled ACCC Cheat Sheet, September 2023. And in this presentation, I'll be going through and looking at all the major announcements made by the ACCC in September and summarising them. And the plan here is to really give very time-poor compliance officers and in-house counsel the opportunity to just listen to half an hour presentation and know exactly what happened from an ACCC perspective in that particular month. And I've done them for July and August, and I'm catching up, and so I'm doing September now, and hopefully by the end of next week I'll be caught up to the end of October. Now, my background, I'm a competition and consumer lawyer, and I've been running my own practice to sale relief consulting for the last 15 years. And I help companies, individuals with competition and consumer law matters. I also do some expert consultancy work for some publishers, legal publishers, on competition and consumer law. Prior to that, I worked at the ACCC for 15 years in a variety of roles, including director enforcement and the director in charge of the Sydney Mergers and Asset Sales branch. Now, the other one's a bit different to usual. There'll be the normal categories of courts, enforcement action, mergers, scams, inquiries, consultations, and other. But there's three new ones this month, or for September: proposed legislative changes, compliance changes, and speeches. Now, there was only one case handed down by the courts in September, and that was against Swift Networks. And Swift Networks was quite a small company that admitted to engaging in cartel conduct by seeking to rig some bids in the supply of technology infrastructure and services to mining village projects. And the allegation was that it had got together with competitor DXC Connect and DXC Technology to try and set the prices for various tenders so that they'd share out who won them. And effectively, the three projects related to projects, two operated by Rio Tinto and one by Fortescue. So a penalty was agreed with the ACCC, and they went to the courts, and the courts signed off on the 1.2 million penalty. So I guess this case shows that even small companies can get caught up in cartel conduct and get fined quite a lot of money. And I think the message here is, if you have engaged in a breach, it's probably a good idea to settle it as quick as possible and minimise both your penalty as well as legal costs. Now, going to enforcement, the big case was eHarmony, and eHarmony, as you may know, is a large US-based company that provides online dating services. And the ACCC commenced legal proceedings against it, alleging a number of contraventions of the Australian consumer law. It's interesting, the allegations that have been alleged seem to be related to sort of dark patterns, subscription traps, some of the things that they've identified in their digital markets reports. The first allegation was that there was this automatic membership subscription trap. So people would sign up to a premium membership and be under the belief that they were signed up for only 6, 12 or 24 months, when in reality there was an automatic renewal function on their membership. So unless they remembered to cancel their subscription, they'd be signed up for an extra period of time. The other three alleged breaches, the first was that they offered this basic membership, which was represented to include an ability to have these ongoing two-way communications with other people, but that wasn't actually a feature of the basic membership. Rather, in order to get that additional functionality, you had to sign up to a premium membership. So that was allegedly misleading conduct. The third allegation related to the failure to display accurate minimum and total prices. So under the ACL, you have to provide full details about the total price that's payable. And here they alleged, the ACCC, that they weren't displaying these prices accurately. And the last allegation was that eHarmony had misrepresented the ability of customers to cancel their subscriptions. There were representations on the website that said there is still an opportunity to withdraw after signing up if you have second thoughts, and also try before you buy and no pressure to sign up, which create this impression that you can cancel really at any time if you change your mind, but in reality you were pretty well locked in. And the ACCC added at the end of the press release that they were, I guess, particularly concerned about eHarmony's conduct because ACCC had specifically interacted with eHarmony in the process of developing its best practice guides for dating websites. So it probably has the view that eHarmony was well aware of the types of issues that it had to try and avoid. The other big case was Energy Australia, and this is the first time the ACCC has taken action for an alleged breach of the Electricity Retail Code. And this particular code brings in various requirements about the price information that electricity retailers have to provide to their consumers. And it tries to encourage or requires the electricity retailers to provide information in a simple and standardised way so that consumers can compare different offers and choose the offer that's best for them. And so the ACCC has alleged that Energy Australia breached the code by failing to include some mandatory information, namely the lowest possible price. So when it's corresponding with its various consumers, it's not including this mandatory information in that correspondence. Also, they alleged the breach of the Australian consumer law, that the estimates of annual costs were not accurate. So there's two primary breaches being alleged by the ACCC. And interestingly, the ACCC came across this conduct by audits of electricity retailers' compliance with the code. So they're conducting regular audits to just check that retailers are complying with their obligations under the code. There were two big mergers opposed in September as well, which is continuing a bit of a trend. Transurban's Eastlink acquisition was opposed, and Eastlink is owned by Horizon Roads. And the ACCC formed the view that the proposed acquisition of a majority interest in Horizon Roads by Transurban would lessen competition in the market for future toll road concessions. Now, it's interesting that Horizon operates the Eastlink toll road and is the only other private toll road operated in Australia. Every other private toll road is operated by Transurban. And so the ACCC was concerned that the proposed acquisition would entrench Transurban's position in Victoria and prevent any rival operator from being able to come into the market. They also noted that Transurban has significant advantages. So there's quite high barriers to entry to this market, and those barriers to entry arise from all the data which Transurban can generate from operating toll roads about demand and usage of its various toll roads. And this gives them a material advantage over other rival bidders for toll roads in being able to work out the appropriate price to submit for the tender. So that's the primary barrier to entry, effectively a barrier to entry arising from access to significant amounts of data. Now, they also looked at the counterfactual, which if Transurban did not acquire Horizon Roads would remain in the market as an independent business and potentially be acquired by somebody else. So likely to be acquired by an overseas operator who would provide a long-term rival to Transurban and also be able to develop the capabilities it needed to try and win other toll road concessions. So I'm not too sure what's happening there, whether Transurban's minded to take the ACCC on, but I have heard that somebody is actually having a close look at Horizon with a view to acquiring the business. Now, the other merger involved Endeavour's proposed acquisition of the Rye Hotel, and the important thing to realise here is the way the ACCC defines markets in relation to retail and takeaway liquor, and effectively they take a very localised view. They view the market as being a series of local markets, and that was established by a case that I ran many years ago. Justice also agreed that the markets in ACCC Liquorland case that they were local markets for the supply of takeaway liquor. So here the ACCC is concerned that Endeavour's acquisition of the Rye Hotel is going to lessen competition in the local market in Rye, because the other major competitor to the Rye Hotel is BWS Rye. So they're the two major competitors. And they're also concerned that the Rye Hotel owns this banner group called the Thirsty Camel, and that potentially could result in lessening competition in the wholesale market for the supply of liquor. So it'd be interesting to see what happens here, because there doesn't seem to be any option for a divestiture. They're only buying the hotel, and so I think it's either Endeavour takes on the ACCC or backs down. There doesn't seem to be another option. Now, there was a particularly nasty scam which the ACCC drew people's attention to in September, and this arose out of the National Anti-Scam Centre, and it was a scam that was particularly prevalent. There was over 1,200 reports and allegedly $8.7 million in losses. And the way it worked was to be a victim who was a Chinese student studying in Australia. They'd be approached by a person who claimed that there was a serious financial crime being conducted using the Chinese student's phone or identity, and the student would deny any involvement in the scam and then be transferred to a person who was claiming to be a Chinese police officer. And interestingly there, the use of this telephone spoofing technology would often show up the phone number that they were calling from as being a legitimate phone number. So that's some new technology which obviously assisting scammers significantly. Then the next step would be that the person pretending to be the Chinese police officer would tell the Chinese student that they would be extradited to China or deported, but there was some way of avoiding that if they were able to make some payment. And at this stage, they would be provided with false documentation, including arrest warrants, to scare the person into paying the money. And it was a very elaborate scam because it wasn't just transferring somebody to a Chinese student to a phone number. In some cases, it actually transferred them to a video call, and there'd be a person on the other side of the video call dressed as a Chinese police officer. So that would lend a lot of credibility to the claims being made by the scammers. And there were also accounts that people had been seen dressed as Chinese police officers attending Australian homes to deliver various documentation. So this is obviously a very elaborate scam being conducted by an organised crime group, and it's obviously very serious. And the big challenge for the Anti-Scam Centre is how to disrupt this particular scam. There's only a couple of ways. Like clearly they might be using some local assets to conduct the scam, in which case the ACCC and other groups might be able to disrupt the use of those Australian assets. Alternatively, it's all operating offshore, then hopefully the anti-scam network can liaise with overseas enforcement agencies and disrupt the scam at that end. Now, there was a lot of inquiries and consultation work done in September as well. The first relates to Australia Post, and the ACCC has a role here in approving any proposed price increases that Australia Post is proposing to introduce, but it's not really approving. Rather, what happens, the ACCC will look at the proposed price increase, consider information from Australia Post about demand and costs, and conclude whether the price increase is reasonable and make a recommendation. But ultimately, Australia Post doesn't have to follow the recommendation of the ACCC. It could very well ignore the recommendation and go ahead with the proposed change. The second series of reports relates to broadband. The ACCC does a lot of work in this area. The first was the Measuring Broadband Australia program reports, which it's been doing for many years now. And it looks at the typical speed and performance of home and small business internet plans. And so it looks at all the different indices and makes various conclusions. In this particular case, they made a conclusion, probably not earth-shattering in a sense, that businesses generally experience good connectivity when the applications are being hosted locally. So if there's a shorter distance between the server and end user, you get better connectivity. The second report looks at how broadband providers are operating in Australia, and it noted in the September report that both Vocus and Aussie Broadband had been picking up a lot of business, 62,000 additional services in the June quarter alone, and that's a very impressive increase in customer base. And it also looked at where did the losses come from. Well, Telstra and TPG lost 76,000 services in the same quarter. So it seems a lot of these new customers of Vocus and Aussie Broadband are coming from Telstra and TPG. Interestingly, in that particular quarter, Optus's market share remained steady at 13.1%. I think it's too much of a guess to say that I think in the next report, given Optus's major failure in November, that market share is going to decline significantly. They also did a report on diesel pricing, and this is an important assessment that the ACCC does. It started in 2007, but in 2022 the government gave the ACCC a further direction to continue monitoring prices, costs and profits in relation to both diesel and petroleum products. And this arose largely from some strange behaviour in the market where prices would go up when international conditions suggested prices should be going down. So this is keeping a close look at pricing, and the conclusion that it reached in relation to diesel pricing in the relevant quarter was that average diesel prices in the 5 largest cities, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, had continued to decrease. to similar levels as retail petrol prices. And the good thing here is they look at what could have caused the impact on prices. So here the ACCC concluded that the reason the price has gone down was due to international factors such as a fall in diesel prices, further exports of diesel and gas oil from Russia despite the sanctions, a decline in North American and European consumption, and unexpected build-up in diesel inventories. So they can see this relationship between these international factors and domestic prices. And if the international factors suggested the prices should have gone down and that domestic prices had gone up, and that would have raised some alarm bells for both the ACCC and the government. The gas supply inquiry report came out, and this is also a wide-ranging inquiry into the supply and demand for natural gas in Australia, and the ACCC has been directed by government to continue doing these inquiries until 2030. And there was a report put out a while ago where the ACCC identified a significant shortfall in the supply of natural gas in Australia, which resulted in a lot of concern, but also resulted in the gas code being brought in, a floor price being introduced for gas, and a range of different measures. And so the ACCC has been looking at the market since that report and has concluded that Australia's East Coast gas market will actually have 1.4 petajoule surplus in the first quarter of 2024. So I think obviously LNG producers have realised that they have to start ensuring the local market's supplied, or there's going to be trouble, further regulation probably, and they've reversed some of their early decisions. And they also note that Australia's southwest southern states are forecast to have 3 petajoule surplus to meet local demand. However, in Queensland, there's going to be a shortage of 1 petajoule. So there's going to have to be some gas moved to Queensland to meet local demands. And one factor that's probably improved the way the market operates is recent investment in key pipeline infrastructure, which has made it easy to transport gas between the northern and southern states. So that's obviously going to assist. If there's a surplus down south, then they can ship it up north to meet the shortage up there. Then there was some legislative changes which were due to come in on the 9th of November, and I'm doing this talk on the 10th of November, so they've already come in. And the ACCC was warning everybody to have a look at their unfair contract terms because the changes to the law are coming in imminently. And I guess the main thing here is that at the moment, at the time when they put the press release out in September, unfair contract terms weren't illegal, they were just void and unenforceable. So from the 9th of November 2023, there would be 2 major changes. Firstly, such terms would be illegal, and secondly, they'd be subject to very big penalties. And as you can see there, the maximum penalties for having an unfair contract term in your standard form contract are now going to be the greatest of 50 million, 3 times the value reasonably attributable to the conduct, or if you can't determine that, 30% of adjusted turnover. So there are enormous penalties which are now in place for unfair contract terms, and there's individual penalties of 2.5 million. The ACCC also included in the press release some tips as to what to do to make your terms fairer. Firstly, consider both points of view. So obviously, most terms that are considered unfair provide somebody with a unilateral right to do something. So if you're considering both points of view, you'll obviously make sure that it doesn't just favour one party over the other. Include counterbalancing terms. So when you look at unfair contract terms, you look at the whole agreement, and there might be some terms that favour one party and some terms that favour the other party, and therefore the balance is that it's a fair contract. So if you have some terms that you believe are necessary to protect your legitimate interest, make sure there's some counterbalancing terms to protect the other party, the small business party's interest as well. Avoid broad terms. So sometimes clauses are drafted much too broadly. If you just add some specificity to the terms, they can become less unfair, or they can become fair. Make sure you meet your obligations under the Australian consumer law. So don't exclude mandatory rights under the Australian consumer law, say consumer guarantees or other rights. Ensure they all remain intact. And also, when you're looking at unfair contract terms, there's a requirement to look at whether the terms are clear, transparent, legible, easily understandable. So that might mean just to rewrite your terms in plain English, getting away from legalistic language or very small writing that is illegible, time to really do a rewrite of your terms and conditions in plain English and in bigger fonts. The proposed change that the ACCC is after is unfair trading practices legislation, and the government has actually opened a consultation on this particular issue. And the genesis of the idea seems to be Section 5 of the US Federal Trade Commission Act, which has an unfair methods of competition provision. I think the ACCC wants something similar, and they've been pushing for this for a while, and I think they're very happy that the government's opened a consultation on it. And they've identified a few types of conduct which they think will be caught by this new provision. Harmful conduct that does not reach the legal threshold for unconscionable conduct. So there have been a few cases where courts have said that conduct was not great, but it wasn't unconscionable. The classic seems to be the Mazda case, where the judge concluded that the conduct was terrible customer service, but not unconscionable. So I think that's a reference to that type of conduct that is really not acceptable, but didn't quite depart significantly enough from community standards to be unconscionable. Other conduct was not misleading or deceptive, but distorts consumer choice by creating confusion or hiding or omitting relevant information. So it sounds a bit to me like a reference to dark patterns, to the use of various embedded aspects to applications on various systems that use behavioural biases to push people in directions when they're making decisions. So a law to prevent the use of unfair dark patterns. And then and this is an interesting one, other terms which are not captured by the unfair contract term provisions as harmful in non-standard form contracts or unfair contract engaged in pursuant to a contract term that is, on its face, a reasonable contract term. Now, the first part's interesting because they effectively want unfair contract term law that goes to other contracts, not simply standard form contracts. The second bit I don't quite understand, but whether a contract term that does appear on its face to be reasonable but has an unfair consequence, that's a little bit vague. So the consultation is open to the 29th of November, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think the government will accept this proposed change, and I think there'll be a change introduced in 2024. Now, another interesting thing that happened in September was the ACCC announced a number of compliance changes, and this was by a letter sent out to practitioners. And currently they operate 4 compliance templates, which go from level 1 to level 4, and level 1's for micro and low risk businesses all the way up to level 4, which is for large high risk businesses. And they identified a number of changes. So the first is level 1 template, which is really for micro businesses, requires the director and any newly inducted permanent staff to complete the ACCC Small Business Education Program. So the ACCC has developed this quite comprehensive small education program, put it on its website. So when you're signing up to a level 1, you don't have to hire somebody like me to come in and train you. You can just go to the website and do that training. I haven't done it yet myself, so I imagine you might get a certificate at the end of it, and that satisfies your obligations under level 1. It also made it clear that newly inducted staff have to receive the same training as current staff, so nothing special, different. Training is mandatory for executive and non-executive directors. So again, that's probably the understanding at the moment, but now it's written down as a requirement. The party required to implement any recommendations the ACCC considers necessary. Again, the ACCC can recommend changes to compliance program. Most businesses would just make them, they wouldn't argue, but this makes it clear that it's a requirement nowadays. Level 2 template now includes the option for a business to appoint an internal compliance professional to carry out reviews of their compliance program rather than independent reviewer. I'm a little bit sad about this one because I do a lot of independent reviewer work, but I did think that level 1 and level 2 shouldn't be required to hire independent review because it's quite costly. And so this makes it clear that they don't have to hire somebody like me to do an independent review, rather than get someone internally, the internal compliance officer, to carry out a review. I'm not sure it's a great idea because it can't really be an independent review. It's the person who probably put together the compliance program is now reviewing it. I think it would have made more sense just to remove the requirement entirely rather than get an independent internal review. The further changes, level 2, 3 and 4 templates have been updated to include optional product safety provisions. So currently only level 4 had the product safety provisions. Now that's been included in level 3 and they've been updated and hopefully shortened a bit. Level 4 template includes a requirement for compliance reporting even where no material failures are identified. So currently, if I were to do a report and identify a material failure, I'd have to alert the ACCC to that. But if I don't identify a material failure, I don't have to provide the report to the ACCC. So in the future, all independent reviewers will have to provide their report to the ACCC. And this is making it an obligation on independent reviewers. Currently what tends to happen is the ACCC ring up a company after an independent review has been completed and ask for a copy of the report, and they get it anyway. But this changes it to a mandatory requirement on independent reviewers. Level 3 template now requires that any complaints handling system comply with the relevant Australian and New Zealand standard. And finally, the option to appoint a compliance advisor internally has been removed for level 4 template. So the level 4 template previously said that you could hire an internal or external person to conduct to be the compliance advisor and effectively conduct the risk assessment. But now you've got to hire somebody externally, which I think makes sense. I think you need somebody independent to do that work. So here's the website which has the small education program, and as I said, it's a very lengthy program, but looks pretty good to me. A couple of speeches during the month. The first was the Traditional Law Council Annual Competition and Consumer Law Workshop speech, which is given by the chairperson, and often has some new developments that have been contemplated by the ACCC. I've got to say, Jenna Cass-Gottlieb's speech didn't really have any major announcements. She summarised the year that's been: compliance enforcement, merger reform, essential services, digital economy, National Anti-Scam Centre, and emerging roles for the ACCC, and that includes water regulation. So it was quite descriptive of what's happened during the year. Probably the thing that I found the most interesting is her observation about this speech by Justice Jago, where she talks about the law having to conceptualise the capacity for debate about a simple principle in competition law, particularly given the rapidity of development of some markets outstripping the pace of policy and legislative responses. So the observation that is the law keeping up with technological and other changes in the economy. And Jenna Cass-Gottlieb argued that that creates the requirement for this precautionary principle, that laws really need to be designed to get ahead of changes in the market. And the reason the regulators have to get ahead of the changes is because, as she says at the end of that paragraph, there is a risk of serious or irreversible competitive harm if you don't get ahead of it. And that's what she believes has to happen in relation to mergers, particularly mergers by digital players. You need to get ahead of the game to stop irreversible harm from occurring. And I think you've also got to err on the side of protecting the public interest. So there's a lot of talk about false positives, false negatives, and the view seems to be that it's worse to stop a potentially pro-competitive merger than to oppose it. And what the view is of the ACCC, it's better to stop the odd pro-competitive or efficiency-enhancing merger than to allow it to occur. So err on the side of caution, stop any merger that's potentially going to lessen competition, because the damage from that merger could be, as it says there, could be irreversible. There was also a speech given about the new gas market code, and again it was quite descriptive of the various powers ACCC has, but I think it was interesting because I thought it seemed like a very strong warning to the gas market to get the house in order or else face some pretty intense ACCC scrutiny. So clearly the Australian government brought in this draft gas market code for consultation. It wanted to improve the competitive dynamics in the market, and as noted in the second paragraph, ACCC is steadfastly committed to this objective. In enforcing the new code, we use our full investigatory and enforcement powers in response to any contraventions or attempts to circumvent the code's obligations. That's a big warning. They're going to go hard with ensuring compliance to the code. And then she notes that, I want to encourage the legal advisors to the gas companies to ensure their clients put in strong compliance programs and practices, and also report promptly any potential breaches. So she's saying, everybody get your house in order, make sure you're a step ahead of where you're supposed to be, because if you're not, the ACCC are going to come after you very hard. And also, if you do breach the law, come and tell us. Don't let us have to catch you. So I thought that sounded like a very strong warning to the gas industry to watch out for the ACCC in this space. There was also the Qantas China Eastern authorization, and what tends to happen is a lot of airlines have received an authorization to work together on various routes due to the public benefits that can be derived. And there was an authorization in place between Qantas and China Eastern Airlines in relation to various routes. And the ACCC decided to decline or deny the authorization, and it was not satisfied that the likely harm to competition from this particular coordination would be outweighed by the public benefits. They were concerned that this alliance would create the opportunity and incentive for both players to increase prices on the relevant routes, particularly on Sydney-Shanghai route. And also they noted that the reason they let it through last time was there was a lot more evidence provided that the coordination would lead to additional services being provided on other routes, but that was absent in this particular application. And I understand that Qantas decided not to challenge the decision, which is probably not surprising given all the I was going to say spot fires, but I don't think they're probably bonfires that they're dealing with on other fronts. There's a bit of commentary. The ACCC continues a very aggressive approach to mergers, and it sort of belies a bit their concern that the merger laws aren't adequate. But at the end of the day, they're opposing these mergers. There's no guarantee that their decision to oppose these mergers is going to be upheld by the Australian Competition Tribunal or the Federal Court. So it doesn't necessarily say the merger laws are adequate. The unfair contract term law changes have come in now, so it's the 10th of November now. Very significant. ACCC is going to come out all guns blazing on that. So if you haven't reviewed your terms and conditions now, you better get cracking on that, because that's going to be an intense area of activity by the ACCC. There's a lot of debate going on about the merger reforms and unfair trading practices. I think ultimately the government's going to agree to both proposed changes, so there's probably not a lot of point arguing the toss if you're in private practice. I think any view that the merger reforms can be turned around at this stage, I think is overly optimistic. And the unfair trading practices, the speed which the government has moved on starting consultation suggests to me that they're keen to introduce it. So I guess get ready for the brave new world. Clearly, I think the ACCC's approach to the gas code enforcement is going to be very aggressive. So I guess if you're in that particular area, be warned and do what the ACCC suggests to get your compliance programs and practices in line. And there have been some very significant changes to compliance obligations which flew under the radar a bit, and it's very important for companies to be aware of those changes, and I guess to ensure that they get the benefit of those changes, particularly smaller businesses don't have to expend as much money. It's not great news for people like myself who go in and help people with a lot of these things, but I think they're good changes. I fully support the changes to the extent that they reduce the cost imposition on small businesses. I guess the only thing I'm a bit disappointed is I think the ACCC should really consult people in the industry about changes like that, particularly compliance professionals like myself and other people who work in this space a bit. So that was a bit disappointing. So hopefully that's been helpful. That's really everything I think happened in September. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to give me a call or drop me an email. Bye-bye.